The silence in the military briefing room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 37 battle-hardened soldiers sat frozen, their eyes locked on a young woman who had just walked through those heavy oak doors. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The newest recruit looked barely old enough to hold a driver's license, let alone survive what they all knew was coming. "She won't last a week," muttered Sergeant Brooks, his scarred face twisting into a smirk. "3 days, maximum," added Corporal Martinez, crossing his muscular arms. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that this quiet young woman carried secrets that would soon turn their entire world upside down. Hidden beneath her calm exterior was a combat record so extraordinary, so impossible to believe, that when the colonel finally stood up to reveal the truth, grown men would fall silent, and some would even shed tears. This is the story of how underestimation became revelation, how doubt transformed into respect, and how one woman's hidden past would rewrite everything these soldiers thought they knew about courage, survival, and the true meaning of strength. Sarah Chun stepped off the military transport bus at Camp Thunderbolt, her small duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a worn leather journal clutched tightly in her other hand. The October wind whipped through the base, sending dust devils dancing across the parade ground, but she barely noticed. Her dark eyes swept across the imposing concrete buildings and endless rows of barracks, taking in every detail with the practiced observation of someone who had learned that survival often depended on noticing what others missed. At barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing no more than 125 pounds, Sarah looked more like a college student than a military recruit. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face held an almost childlike quality that made her appear even younger than her 22 years. The other new arrivals towered over her, their broad shoulders and confident strides painting a sharp contrast to her quiet, almost hesitant movements. "Fresh meat," bellowed Drill Sergeant Morrison as the group of new recruits lined up in formation. His voice boomed across the training ground like thunder, causing several of the newcomers to flinch. Sarah, however, remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and controlled. "Welcome to hell, ladies and gentlemen. For the next 12 weeks, you belong to me." The other recruits exchanged nervous glances, but Sarah's expression never changed. She had heard worse threats before, had faced far more terrifying situations than an angry drill sergeant. The memories flickered through her mind like old photographs. The sound of gunfire echoing through mountain valleys, the acrid smell of smoke and burning metal, the weight of equipment that had once seemed impossible to carry. "You there, Tiny?" Morrison's voice cut through her thoughts as he stopped directly in front of her. "What's your name, recruit?" "Sarah Chun, drill sergeant," she replied, her voice clear and steady despite her small stature. Morrison leaned down until his face was inches from hers, his eyes searching for any sign of fear or weakness. Well, Chun, looks like they're letting anyone join up these days. Tell me, sweetheart, what makes you think you can handle what we're about to put you through?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah could feel the eyes of every other recruit burning into her. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few seemed almost sympathetic, as if they already pitted what they assumed would be her inevitable failure. She had seen these looks before, had grown accustomed to being underestimated by people who judged her solely on her appearance. "I'm here to serve, drill sergeant," she replied simply. Morrison straightened up and let out a harsh laugh. "Serve? Kid, you look like you'd have trouble serving coffee, let alone serving your country in combat. But, hey, we'll see what you're made of soon enough." As the group was led to their barracks, Sarah could hear the whispered conversations of her fellow recruits. Most of them were typical military hopefuls, young men and women from small towns looking for direction, college graduates seeking adventure, or individuals from military families continuing a proud tradition. They talked eagerly about their reasons for enlisting, their fears about basic training, and their dreams of military glory. Sarah remained silent, unpacking her few belongings with methodical precision. Her bunkmate, a cheerful young woman named Jessica Martinez from Texas, tried repeatedly to draw her into conversation. "So where are you from, Sarah?" Jessica asked, hanging up her civilian clothes in the small metal locker. "Around," Sarah replied quietly, carefully placing her leather journal in the bottom drawer of her bedside table. "Come on, everyone's from somewhere. I'm from Houston, born and raised. My daddy was a Marine, and his daddy before him. It's kind of family tradition, you know?" Sarah nodded politely, but offered no additional information about her own background. The truth was far too complicated, too painful to explain to someone she had just met. How could she tell Jessica about the village in Afghanistan, where she had spent 3 years of her childhood while her missionary parents worked to build schools and hospitals? How could she describe the day everything changed, when the sound of approaching helicopters had meant rescue for some and death for others? The first few days of basic training followed a predictable pattern. The physical training was intense, designed to push every recruit to their absolute limits. During morning runs, Sarah consistently finished in the middle of the pack, not last but never first. She completed her push-ups and sit-ups with quiet determination, meeting the minimum requirements without excelling or drawing attention to herself. It was during combat training that the other recruits began to take real notice of her unusual behavior. When they practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques, Sarah moved with a fluidity that seemed almost instinctive. Her strikes were precise and controlled, her defensive movements economical and effective. But whenever an instructor complimented her technique or asked where she had learned to fight, she would deflect the question with a simple, "I've always been interested in self-defense." Sergeant Brooks, one of the more experienced instructors, began watching her more closely during weapons training. Sarah handled firearms with a familiarity that went beyond basic instruction. Her stance was perfect, her grip steady, and her accuracy consistently above average. But, again, when questioned about her previous experience, she remained evasive. "Most recruits take weeks to achieve that level of accuracy," Brooks commented after Sarah had hit 9 out of 10 targets during a pistol exercise. "You sure you haven't done this before?" "Just following your instructions, Sergeant," she replied, carefully cleaning her weapon with practiced efficiency. The other recruits began to whisper among themselves about their mysterious bunkmate. Some theorized that she came from a military family and was simply being modest about her background. Others suggested she might have been in law enforcement or private security before enlisting. But none of their guesses came close to the truth. Late at night, when the barracks were quiet except for the occasional snore or restless movement, Sarah would lie awake staring at the ceiling. The memories she worked so hard to suppress during the day would surface in the darkness, playing out like scenes from a movie she wished she had never seen. She remembered the weight of the AK-47 that had been thrust into her 12-year-old hands by a boy not much older than herself. She could still feel the rough texture of the mountain cave, where she had hidden for 6 days, surviving on rainwater and wild berries while the sounds of battle raged in the valley below. Most vividly, she remembered the face of Captain Rodriguez, the Army Ranger who had found her and changed the course of her life forever. "You're safe now, kid," he had said in heavily accented English, wrapping his own jacket around her shivering shoulders. "We're going to get you home." But home had been a complicated concept for Sarah even before that terrible week in the mountains. Her parents' work with international aid organizations had taken the family all over the world: refugee camps in Sudan, earthquake zones in Haiti, war-torn regions of the Middle East. She had learned to adapt, to blend in, to survive in situations that would terrify most adults, let alone children. The attack on their compound had been swift and brutal. Sarah had watched from her hiding place as armed militants overran the medical facility where her parents worked. She had seen her father try to protect the local staff, had heard her mother's voice calling her name before the gunfire drowned out everything else. For 6 days, she had waited for rescue while learning lessons about survival that no child should ever have to learn. Captain Rodriguez and his team had found her during a routine patrol, thin and frightened but alive. The official reports listed her as a civilian casualty, a missionary's daughter who had been lucky to survive. They never mentioned the 4 enemy combatants whose bodies were found in the cave with her, or the improvised weapons she had crafted from materials scavenged from the compound, or the tactical knowledge she had somehow acquired during those 6 days of terror. Lights out. The drill sergeant's voice snapped Sarah back to the present, and she listened as the other recruits settled into their bunks for another night of fitful sleep. Tomorrow would bring more training, more tests, more opportunities for her fellow soldiers to underestimate her capabilities. She closed her eyes and tried to push away the memories, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of Jessica's breathing from the next bunk. But even as sleep finally began to claim her, Sarah knew that her carefully constructed facade of ordinariness would not last forever. Sooner or later, the truth about her past would surface, and when it did, everything would change. The leather journal in her bedside drawer contained more than just personal reflections. It held detailed accounts of every engagement, every survival situation, every moment of combat she had experienced since that first terrible week in the mountains. The pages were filled with tactical observations, equipment assessments, and lessons learned in conflicts most people only read about in newspapers. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah wondered what her fellow recruits would think if they knew that the quiet young woman in Bunk 23 had already seen more combat than most career soldiers would experience in their entire service. She wondered how long she could continue to hide in plain sight, pretending to be just another hopeful recruit instead of the battle-tested survivor she had become. The answer would come sooner than she expected, in circumstances that would force her to choose between maintaining her carefully guarded anonymity and doing what she had always done when lives were on the line, whatever it took to ensure that everyone made it home alive. The emergency alarm pierced through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife, jolting every recruit from their sleep. Sarah's eyes snapped open instantly, her body already moving before her mind fully processed the sound. Years of conditioned response had taught her that the difference between life and death often came down to seconds, and those seconds started the moment danger announced itself. All recruits to the assembly area. This is not a drill. Sergeant Morrison's voice boomed through the barrack speakers, but Sarah was already pulling on her boots while most of her bunkmates were still trying to figure out what was happening. What's going on? Jessica mumbled, fumbling around in the darkness for her uniform. Emergency deployment, Sarah replied quietly, her movements swift and efficient as she secured her gear. The familiar weight of equipment felt natural on her shoulders, like putting on clothes she had worn 1,000 times before. Within minutes, the entire recruit company was assembled in the cold morning air, their breath forming small clouds in the October chill. Colonel Henderson stood before them, his weathered face grave in the harsh glare of the floodlights. Behind him, several military vehicles were being loaded with supplies and equipment. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice carrying clearly across the formation. "We have received reports of a catastrophic earthquake in a mountain region approximately 60 miles north of our position. Multiple civilian communities are cut off, and early reports suggest significant casualties. A full rescue operation is being mobilized, but due to the terrain and weather conditions, we need every available person." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from recognition. She had been in earthquake zones before, had seen firsthand the devastation that could result when nature decided to reshape the landscape in minutes. She knew the challenges they would face: unstable structures, blocked roads, injured civilians who needed immediate medical attention, and the constant threat of aftershocks that could turn rescue missions into death traps. "This will be your first real-world deployment," Colonel Henderson continued. "You will be working alongside experienced personnel, but I want you to understand that this is not training. Lives are at stake, and your actions over the next several days may determine whether people live or die." The convoy departed Camp Thunderbolt as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost peaceful compared to the urgency of their mission. Sarah sat quietly in the back of one of the transport trucks, watching the landscape change from flat training grounds to rolling hills and, finally, to the steep, tree-covered mountains where the disaster had struck. Her fellow recruits chattered nervously among themselves, some excited by the prospect of their first real mission, others clearly apprehensive about what they might encounter. Sarah listened to their conversations with half an ear, her attention focused instead on the tactical challenges ahead. The narrow mountain roads would make supply lines vulnerable. The terrain would limit evacuation options. The weather forecast called for rain, which would increase the risk of landslides and make search operations exponentially more dangerous. "You're awfully quiet back there, Chun," observed Private Williams, a large young man from Michigan who had appointed himself the informal leader of their recruit squad. "Nervous about your first real deployment?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Just thinking about what we might encounter," she replied. "Don't worry," Williams said with the confidence of someone who had never faced genuine danger. "The experienced guys will handle the heavy lifting. We're probably just going to be moving supplies and setting up tents." Sarah nodded politely, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that there was no point in arguing with people who were determined to maintain their illusions about the nature of emergency situations. They would understand soon enough what real disaster response looked like. The first signs of the earthquake's impact became visible long before they reached the affected communities. Rock slides had partially blocked several sections of the mountain highway, forcing the convoy to navigate around massive boulders and debris. Power lines lay twisted and broken along the roadside, and in the distance, smoke columns rose from what appeared to be structure fires. "Jesus," whispered Private Thompson, staring out at the destruction. "Look at that." The town of Cedar Falls had once been a picturesque mountain community of about 3,000 people. Now it looked like a war zone. The main street was clogged with rubble from collapsed buildings, and several structures that remained standing showed obvious signs of severe damage. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights moved through the debris-strewn streets, and the sound of chainsaws and heavy machinery filled the air. As soon as the convoy stopped, the organized chaos of disaster response enveloped them. Experienced rescue personnel immediately began coordinating with local emergency services, establishing command centers, and dividing the affected area into search sectors. The recruits were initially assigned to support roles, unloading supplies, setting up temporary shelters, and assisting with crowd control at the evacuation center. Sarah worked efficiently alongside her fellow recruits, but her eyes continuously scanned their surroundings, automatically cataloging potential hazards and escape routes. She noticed things that others missed. The way certain damaged buildings leaned at angles that suggested imminent collapse, the sound of gas leaks hissing from broken lines, the panicked behavior of animals that often preceded aftershocks. It was during their second day at the disaster site that Sarah's carefully maintained cover began to crack. The rescue teams had been working around the clock to locate survivors trapped in the collapsed buildings, but progress was slow and dangerous. The main elementary school had partially collapsed during the earthquake, and while most of the students and teachers had been evacuated safely, reports suggested that several people might still be trapped in the building's basement. Sarah was helping to organize medical supplies when she overheard the conversation between Captain Morrison and two of the experienced rescue specialists. "The structure is too unstable," one of them was saying, shaking his head grimly. "We've had 3 aftershocks in the past 6 hours, and the engineering assessment shows that the remaining walls could come down at any moment. It's too risky to send anyone inside. But the thermal imaging shows at least 2 heat signatures in the basement area," Captain Morrison argued. "We can't just abandon them." "I understand that, sir, but we can't risk losing rescue personnel on what might be a suicide mission. The building could collapse completely with the next aftershock." Sarah set down the medical supply box she was carrying and moved closer to the group, studying the building in question. The elementary school was a 3-story brick structure that had been built in the 1960s. The earthquake had caused the second and third floors to pancake down onto the first floor, but she could see that the basement level might still be intact beneath the rubble. She had been in similar situations before, had learned to read the signs that indicated whether a damaged building could be safely navigated or should be avoided entirely. This one was definitely dangerous, but not impossible. The key would be finding the right entry point and moving quickly but carefully through the debris field. "Excuse me, Captain," she said quietly, approaching the group. "I might have a suggestion." Captain Morrison turned to look at her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "Chun, right? What is it, recruit?" "Sir, I've looked at the building, and I think there might be a way to reach the basement areas safely. The collapse pattern suggests that the southeast corner is relatively stable, and if we can access the building through that area, we might be able to create a safe corridor to the basement." The rescue specialists exchanged glances, clearly skeptical that a recruit would have anything meaningful to contribute to such a complex operation. "With all due respect, Chin," one of them said, "structural assessment requires years of training and experience. This isn't something you learn in basic training." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "You're right, sir. It's something you learn by doing it." There was something in her tone, a quiet confidence that made Captain Morrison look at her more carefully. "What exactly are you suggesting, recruit?" "Give me 10 minutes to do a more detailed assessment of the building," Sarah replied. "If I can identify a safe entry point and extraction route, I'd like permission to attempt the rescue." "Absolutely not," the senior rescue specialist said immediately. "We're not sending an untrained recruit into a collapse zone. It's out of the question." But Captain Morrison held up his hand, studying Sarah's face intently. "Where did you learn about structural assessment, Chun?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that her answer would change everything. But in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of someone calling for help from beneath the rubble, and she realized that her cover story was less important than the lives that hung in the balance. "Haiti, sir," she said quietly. "After the earthquake in 2010, I spent 8 months working with international rescue teams, pulling survivors out of collapsed buildings in Port-au-Prince." The statement hit the group like a physical blow. Captain Morrison's eyes widened, and both rescue specialists stared at her in shock. "You were in Haiti?" Morrison asked. "How old were you?" 14, sir." 14. The senior rescue specialist shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible. The international rescue operations in Haiti were restricted to trained professionals and military personnel." Sarah's expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness that spoke of experiences far beyond her years. "My parents were killed in the initial collapse. I was trapped for 2 days before a French rescue team pulled me out. After that, I had nowhere else to go, so I stayed and helped." "Help how?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Any way I could, sir. Crawling through spaces too small for the adults, translating for survivors who only spoke Creole, learning to read the signs that indicated whether a building was safe to enter or about to come down." The silence stretched between them as the implications of her words sank in. This quiet young recruit who had spent the past several weeks being overlooked and underestimated was claiming to have operational experience in one of the most challenging disaster zones of the modern era. 8 months, Morrison repeated slowly. "What did you do after Haiti?" Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time since the conversation began, she looked away. "I moved on to the next disaster, sir. There's always a next disaster." Before anyone could respond, another aftershock rolled through the area, causing the damaged elementary school to groan and shift ominously. Dust and debris showered down from the unstable structure, and somewhere in the basement, the calls for help grew more desperate. Sarah stepped forward, her decision made. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to attempt the rescue. Those people don't have much time left." Captain Morrison looked from Sarah to the crumbling building and back again. Everything in his training told him not to send an untrained recruit into such a dangerous situation. But something in Sarah Chen's eyes told him that she might not be as untrained as her file suggested. "You understand that this is completely against protocol?" he said finally. "Yes, sir. And You're aware that if that building comes down while you're inside, there's a very good chance we won't be able to get you out? Yes, sir. Morrison studied her face for another long moment, then nodded slowly. 10 minutes for your assessment. If you can convince me that you have a viable plan, I'll consider letting you try. As Sarah moved toward the damaged building, her fellow recruits watched in stunned silence. Jessica Martinez grabbed Private Williams's arm, her face pale with worry. She's going to get herself killed, Jessica whispered. Why is Morrison even considering this? Williams shook his head, staring after Sarah with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. I don't know, he said quietly, but I'm starting to think we don't know Chun as well as we thought we did. Sarah approached the elementary school with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before. Her eyes traced the crack patterns in the walls, noted the angle of the debris, and identified the load-bearing elements that would determine whether the structure could support additional weight. She tested handholds, measured spaces with her body, and listened carefully to the sounds the building made as it settled. When she returned to the group 10 minutes later, her assessment was thorough and professional. She had identified a route through the debris that would minimize exposure to unstable areas, determined the equipment that would be needed for the extraction, and calculated the time window they would have before the next major aftershock was likely to occur. The southeast corner entry point is viable, she reported to Captain Morrison. The debris field creates a natural tunnel that leads directly to the basement stairwell. The risks are manageable if we move quickly and follow proper safety protocols. Morrison listened to her detailed plan, asked probing questions about potential complications, and found himself increasingly convinced that Sarah Chun was not the inexperienced recruit he had assumed her to be. All right, Chun, he said finally, you've got my permission to attempt the rescue. But you're not going in alone. I'm assigning Sergeant Brooks to accompany you. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was a compromise Morrison had to make to satisfy protocol requirements. She had worked with inexperienced partners before and knew how to adapt her approach accordingly. As she prepared to enter the collapsed building, Sarah caught sight of her fellow recruits watching from the safe zone that had been established around the structure. Their faces showed a mixture of fear, admiration, and confusion as they tried to reconcile this confident, capable woman with the quiet recruit they thought they knew. Private Williams stepped forward from a group. Chun, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the debris field. Be careful in there. Sarah turned back toward him and nodded once, and for just a moment, her carefully controlled expression softened slightly. I will, she replied. Then she turned toward the damaged building, checked her equipment one final time, and disappeared into the rubble to save lives she had never met, just as she had done countless times before in places most people only knew from news reports and nightmare stories. The real Sarah Chun was finally stepping out of the shadows, and nothing would ever be the same again. The rescue took 47 minutes from start to finish, but for everyone watching from the safety zone, it felt like hours. Sarah and Sergeant Brooks had disappeared into the collapsed elementary school, while the rest of the rescue team maintained radio contact and monitored for signs of further structural failure. The building groaned and shifted constantly, sending small avalanches of debris tumbling down its damaged walls. But somehow the makeshift tunnel Sarah had identified held firm. When they finally emerged, carrying a school custodian and an 8-year-old girl who had been trapped since the earthquake struck, the silence that greeted them was absolute. The child clung to Sarah's neck, whispering, "Thank you," in Spanish while tears streamed down her dust-covered face. The custodian, whose leg had been pinned beneath a fallen beam for 2 days, kept repeating that he had thought no one would ever find them. Medical team to the extraction point. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, but his eyes never left Sarah as she gently transferred the child to waiting paramedics. There was something different about the way she moved, a fluidity and confidence that spoke of experience far beyond her years or her official military record. As the survivors were loaded into ambulances and rushed to the field hospital, Sarah began removing her rescue equipment with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the operation. Her uniform was torn and covered in concrete dust, and a small cut on her forehead leaked blood down the side of her face, but her expression remained calm and focused. "Chun," Captain Morrison's voice stopped her as she prepared to rejoin her fellow recruits. "I need to see you in the command tent." "Now." Sarah nodded and followed him across the debris-strewn street to the temporary command center that had been established in the parking lot of the town's only surviving church. Inside the tent, several senior officers were studying maps and coordinating search operations, but Morrison led her to a quieter corner where they could speak privately. "That was professional-level rescue work in there," he said without preamble. "I've seen experienced disaster response specialists who couldn't have executed that operation as smoothly as you just did." "Thank you, sir." "That wasn't a compliment, Chun. It was an observation, and it raises some serious questions about who you really are and what you're doing in basic training." Sarah met his gaze steadily, but remained silent. "Your service record shows that you enlisted 6 months ago with no prior military experience," Morrison continued. "High school graduate, some college coursework, no specialized training or certifications. According to your file, the most dangerous thing you've ever done is work as a lifeguard at a community pool." "That's correct, sir. But that person couldn't have done what you just did. That person wouldn't have known how to read structural damage patterns or navigate a collapse zone or maintain radio discipline under extreme stress. So I'm going to ask you again, who are you really, and what aren't you telling us?" Before Sarah could respond, the tent flap opened and Colonel Henderson stepped inside. His weathered face was grim, and he carried a thick manila folder under his arm that Sarah recognized with a sinking heart. She had hoped her carefully constructed new identity would hold up longer than this, but she knew that her actions during the rescue had probably triggered background checks that would uncover information she had worked hard to keep buried. "Captain Morrison," Henderson said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I need to speak with Recruit Chun privately." Morrison looked from the colonel to Sarah and back again, clearly understanding that something significant was happening, but not sure what. "Yes, sir," he replied, and left the tent without another word. Colonel Henderson waited until they were alone before opening the folder and spreading its contents across the table between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized photographs, official reports, and documents she had hoped never to see again. "Sarah Elizabeth Chun," Henderson began, reading from the top page. "Born in Seattle, Washington, to Dr. Michael Chun and Dr. Rebecca Chun, both medical missionaries with the International Relief Corps. Traveled extensively with parents to disaster zones and conflict areas throughout childhood and adolescence." He turned to the next page, which contained a photograph that made Sarah's hands tremble slightly. It showed a much younger version of herself, thin and hollow-eyed, standing next to a U.S. Army officer in desert camouflage. First official military contact at age 12 in Afghanistan, when Army Rangers recovered her from a Taliban stronghold after her parents' medical compound was overrun. Spent 6 days in enemy territory before rescue, during which time she eliminated 4 hostile combatants using improvised weapons and tactical knowledge acquired through unknown means. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push away the memories that the colonel's words were bringing back. She could still smell the smoke from the burning compound, still hear the screams of the patients and medical staff who hadn't been able to escape in time. After repatriation to the United States, subject was placed in protective custody while military intelligence attempted to determine how a 12-year-old civilian had acquired advanced survival and combat skills. Henderson turned another page. Investigation was suspended when subject disappeared from protective custody 3 weeks later. "I wasn't a prisoner," Sarah said quietly, speaking for the first time since Henderson had begun reading. "But I wasn't free either. They wanted to study me like some kind of specimen." Henderson nodded and continued reading. Subject reappeared in Haiti 14 months later, working with French rescue teams during earthquake recovery operations. Age 13. demonstrated advanced knowledge of structural engineering, emergency medicine, and disaster response protocols. The pages kept turning, each one containing details of disasters and conflicts that Sarah had hoped to leave behind. Somalia during the famine, Japan after the tsunami, Syria during the early years of the Civil War. Each entry documented her presence at scenes of devastation, her unofficial work with military and humanitarian organizations, and her inexplicable ability to operate effectively in situations that would overwhelm most trained professionals. The pattern continues for the next 9 years, Henderson said, closing the folder finally. No permanent address, no official employment, no legal documentation of her activities. But somehow, Sarah Chin appears at every major disaster and conflict zone, working with whoever needs help, saving lives, and then disappearing before anyone can ask too many questions. Sarah stared at the closed folder, knowing that it contained only a fraction of her real story. There were operations that had never been officially documented, people she had helped who were never named in reports, and skills she had acquired through necessity rather than training. The question is, Henderson continued, why someone with your background and experience decided to enlist as a regular Army recruit instead of applying for a specialized position that would make better use of your capabilities. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because I'm tired, sir. Tired of moving from one disaster to another. Tired of being the person who shows up when everything has already gone wrong. Tired of never having a home or a unit or people who know who I really am. Her voice remained steady, but Henderson could hear the years of exhaustion and isolation beneath the professional facade. I thought maybe if I started over, if I became just another recruit going through regular training, I could learn how to be part of something instead of always being on the outside looking in. Henderson studied her face carefully. And how's that working out for you? Not very well, apparently. No, he agreed. It's not. Because you can't hide what you are, Chun. Today proved that. When lives were on the line, you didn't hesitate to use everything you've learned, everything you've experienced to save those people. That's not something you can train out of someone or suppress with a fake identity. Sarah nodded, understanding that her carefully constructed new life was effectively over. What happens now, sir? Instead of answering immediately, Henderson walked to the tent entrance and called for Captain Morrison and Sergeant Brooks to join them. When both men were seated, he reopened the folder and began explaining Sarah's real background, starting with that first encounter in Afghanistan and continuing through her unofficial work in disaster zones around the world. Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to amazement to something approaching awe as the full scope of Sarah's experience became clear. Sergeant Brooks, who had worked alongside her during the rescue, kept shaking his head in disbelief. 23 confirmed combat engagements across 6 countries, Henderson read from one of the reports. 14 successful extractions of civilian personnel from hostile territory. 41 verified rescues during natural disasters. Multiple commendations from international organizations and military units. My God, Morrison whispered. She's practically a one-person special operations unit. Which brings us to the current situation, Henderson said, closing the folder again. Chun, you enlisted under false pretenses, using forged documents and a fabricated background. Technically, that's grounds for discharge and possible criminal charges. Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. She had known this moment might come eventually. However, Henderson continued, and his tone shifted slightly. Your actions today saved 2 lives at considerable personal risk. Moreover, your actual qualifications far exceed anything we could have hoped to find in a standard recruit. So I'm prepared to offer you an alternative. Sarah looked up, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since Henderson had opened that damning folder. We have a new special operations unit being formed, he explained. Personnel are handpicked based on unique skills and real-world experience rather than traditional military career paths. The mission profile includes disaster response, civilian rescue operations, and unconventional warfare in complex environments. Morrison leaned forward in his chair. You're talking about Project Sentinel. Henderson nodded. I am. And I think Recruit Shun would make an excellent addition to the team, provided she's willing to be honest about her background and work within official military structure instead of operating as a freelance asset. Sarah considered the offer carefully. It would mean giving up her anonymity permanently, accepting oversight and accountability in ways she hadn't experienced since childhood. But it would also mean having resources, support, and, most importantly, a place where her skills could be used to help people without the constant need for deception and false identities. What about the other recruits? She asked. My squad, the people I've been training with. That's actually part of why I call Morrison and Brooks in here, Henderson replied. They've been watching you for weeks, try to figure out why you didn't seem to fit the profile of a typical recruit. Now they know why. And I want them to be the ones to explain to your fellow recruits what just happened here. Morrison nodded slowly. They deserve to know the truth. They've been training alongside someone who's already accomplished more in real combat than most soldiers will in their entire careers. More than that, Brooks added, they need to understand that courage and capability don't always come in the packages we expect. Shun has been showing them all along what real strength looks like, but they were too busy looking at her size and age to notice. Henderson turned back to Sarah. So what's your decision, Shun? Are you ready to step out of the shadows and become part of a real military unit? Sarah thought about Jessica Martinez's friendly attempts at conversation, about Private Williams's protective attitude toward his squad, about all the young men and women who had shared the past few weeks of training with her. They had seen her as someone who needed their protection, never realizing that she had been watching over them in ways they couldn't imagine. Yes, sir, she said finally. I'm ready. Henderson smiled for the first time since entering the tent. Outstanding. Morrison, I want you to assemble the entire recruit company in 1 hour. We're going to have a conversation about the nature of service, the meaning of courage, and the importance of never underestimating someone based on their appearance. As the meeting broke up and the officers prepared to leave, Morrison stopped at the tent entrance and looked back at Sarah. For what it's worth, Chun, he said quietly, I've never seen anything like what you did in that building today. Your parents would have been proud. Sarah's carefully controlled composure cracked slightly, and for just a moment, the scared 12-year-old girl she had once been flickered across her features. Thank you, sir, she whispered. An hour later, the entire recruit company stood in formation while Colonel Henderson told them the story of their quiet bunkmate who had been hiding in plain sight among them. He spoke about the village in Afghanistan where a little girl had learned that sometimes survival meant fighting back. He described the earthquake zones and conflict areas where she had spent her teenage years saving lives while other people her age were worried about homework and dating. When he finished speaking, the silence was absolute. 37 recruits stood motionless, trying to process the revelation that the young woman they had consistently underestimated possessed more combat experience than their instructors. Private Williams was the first to break formation. He walked directly to Sarah, stopped in front of her, and executed a perfect military salute. Ma'am, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the formation. It's been an honor serving alongside you. One by one, the other recruits followed suit, each offering their own salute to the woman who had spent weeks letting them believe she was just another inexperienced soldier in need of their guidance and protection. Jessica Martinez was the last to approach, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find words. I'm sorry, she finally managed. I'm sorry we didn't see what you really were. Sarah returned each salute with military precision, but when Jessica spoke, her professional facade slipped once again. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see, she replied gently. And you welcomed me into your squad and made me feel like I belonged somewhere. That meant more to me than you'll ever know. As the sun set over the disaster zone, Sarah Chen finally stopped hiding from who she really was. The quiet recruit was gone forever, replaced by the experienced soldier she had always been but never been allowed to acknowledge. The future held new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to use her hard-won skills in service of something greater than herself. But for the first time in over a decade, she wouldn't be facing those challenges alone. She had a unit now, people who knew her story and accepted her for who she really was. And that, more than any medal or commendation, was worth everything she had sacrificed to get here. The colonel had revealed her combat tally, and the truth had set her free.